What are the tithes and offerings in Malachi 3:8? Stick around, we're going to talk about that today. Welcome to the Profit Dare. I am Tim Kaiser. On this channel, we provide simple financial solutions and inspire savvy stewardship. If this is your first time stopping by, thank you so much. If you have been here before and decided for round two, thank you for coming back. And if you're a subscriber, blessings to you. Your partnership is genuinely appreciated. So today we're going to talk about tithes and offerings from Malachi 3:8. Now this video is inspired by two articles I wrote on the Profit Air website. One is on tithes in Malachi and one is on offerings in Malachi. And often those two terms are tossed around kind of cavalierly, in a cavalier manner in most churches that actually talk about money, because not every church talks about money, unfortunately. So today we're going to talk about that. So when someone says, pay your tithes or pay your offerings, what does that mean from a biblical context? Not what we have kind of shoehorned it to mean in our modern 21st century church, but what does it actually mean? So let's go to Malachi 3:8, and this is from the NIV. Will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how are we robbing you? In tithes and offerings. So that's simple, one verse, and we have rarely questioned what that actually means. So let's take the next 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes and talk about this, how this applies to the modern church. So Malachi was written under the law. Malachi is the last prophetic book in the Old Covenant before Jesus arrives on the scene. And God is rebuking the nation of Israel, and specifically he's rebuking the Levites and the priests, and to a lesser extent the people in this entire book. And he's getting to the meat of the matter here. He says, you're robbing me. Now we all kind of know what robbing means. You're stealing something from somebody, you're taking something that doesn't belong to you, whatever. In this case, let's talk about the tithe first, or tithes, because he says, you're robbing me, and how in tithes, plural, and offerings, plural, are the tithes in the Old Covenant? Well, there were at least 3 tithes. The first tithe was the Levitical tithe. Now, when the tribes of Israel were given their inheritance in the Promised Land, the tribe of Levi did not receive an inheritance, a land inheritance. Their inheritance was the tithe. And the priests are part of the tribe of Levi. They're just more granular in that they are part of the household of Aaron, Moses' brother. Aaron. So those all come from the tribe of Levi. And so here we go, right? So the first tithe is the Levitical tithe, and that is their inheritance. So 10% of crops were provided or brought to the Levites in the Levitical cities. That's tithe number 1, so 10% of crops. Also, there was in Leviticus 27, every 10th animal was also tithed. Now, the crazy part of this is you can't divide an animal and keep it alive, right? So you can get, say if you're harvesting wheat, you can make it granular, right? But an animal, you can't. So everyone says, well, tithe is 10th. Well, it was every 10th animal, and it was not the best animals. It was every 10th animal. That's very specific in Leviticus 27. So every 10th animal that went under the rod was actually brought to the Levites. And so if you had 19, you would still only give 1. If you had 9, you wouldn't give any, right? So there is a significance there, because people get really legalistic when it comes to the 10th. So there's the Levitical tithe, then we have the cattle tithe. So there's probably 4 tithes. This is something David Croteau teaches, and he's way more, he's an expert in this subject, way more so than me. And the second tithe is the festival tithe. There were three festivals that the Israelites were celebrated in Jerusalem. And that time, then also 10% tithe was given as a way to celebrate the festivals. So now we're looking at 20%. So in years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the tithing expectation was 20%. 10% for the Levites, 10% for the festivals. Here we go, another one. The next tithe, technically the third tithe, maybe the fourth tithe, depending on how you want to divide it up, is for charity, the charity tithe. And this was given every 3 years and is also 10% and was meant as basically what you call a social safety net in this theocracy. So years 3 and year 6, there was an additional tithe. So farmers, landowners, people who owned farms and groves or vineyards or whatever, year 1 they gave 20 of their crops, gave 20% of their crops. Year 2, 20% of their crops. Year 3, 30% of their crops. Year 4, 20%. Year 5, 20%. Year 6, 30%. And the 7th year, no one tithed. So then that's that, right? And then they also gave 1/10 of every animal in those 6 years. So the tithe was that. So when Malachi says, you're robbing me in tithes, that's what he's talking about. Perhaps people were not bringing the tithe to the Levites, and it's also possible the Levites, who also had to tithe to the priests, they gave 1/10 of a tenth. Here's something that people don't realize. The priests received 1% of the tithe, 1/10 of the tenth. The people brought the tithe to the Levites, and then the Levites used that, and they actually gave as a offering or so a tithe of the tithe. And these are all actual scriptures. It's not theology by folklore. So when Malachi was saying that, he was talking very specifically about tithes that were done in the nation of Israel by Israelites, brought to the Levites, and ultimately to the temple. That's why if you really want to separate this from the New Testament concept, how we can't do this. We physically cannot do this because none of us, probably no one listening to my voice right now, lives in Israel. And if you do, you probably don't have a farm. And 3, you don't have a tribe of Levi anymore, and there is no temple. And so the tithe was not money. It was not money. Money was given to the priests and the Levites in certain circumstances. There was money given for the redemption of the firstborn. If a person wanted to redeem their tithe, they could actually do so. Let's say you brought this is Leviticus 27, you had this huge harvest, and you're like, man, this is a long ways to take this thing. I'd rather just sell my harvest here and give the priest money. You could do that. That was discouraged, and the discouragement point was there's a 20% fee attached to it. So instead of your tithe being 10%, if you wanted to give money, you had to up it to 12%. So you could do the value of this. So the money was given to the priests and the Levites in certain circumstances, but the tithe in and of itself that Malachi is referring to was always edible food products grown in the nation of Israel, given to a Levite and ultimately to the priests for the temple. For the Levites, for the festivals, which we no longer celebrate, and for the poor tithe, and for the charity tithe, which there was time people gave money, but tithing wasn't one of them. So in our case, in the modern church, it's impossible for a Christian to tithe. It is. If you want to stay true to the biblical text, if you want to make the Bible say what you want it to say, and you want to massage it and iron it out and take it out of context, knock yourself out, I would highly discourage that kind of action, though, because if you do it on this thing, you'll do it on a lot of things. All right, so tithing, robbing God of tithes. Christians cannot rob God of the tithe because they cannot tithe. All right, how about offerings? Now, in our modern vernacular, see, I was raised in the prosperity gospel. So a lot of the stuff I heard on a daily or weekly basis, you bring your tithe to the priest, which was the pastor, and then anything above and beyond that was considered an offering. Offerings could not be given unless the tithe was first satisfied. That was what was taught to me. And so we're Christians that tithe are often very legalistic when it comes to how much they give. I do financial talk conversations and counseling and coaching, and I hear stories, and I never discourage people from giving 10%. That's something that's in between them and God. I personally believe I have a different interpretation, but my motivation is not to be stingy or to be greedy. So if that might cause someone to stumble. So if they have it in their head that they have to give 10%, they will. But some of the ways they do it, so you're looking at a budget. Let's say someone's paycheck is, we'll make it really, a small paycheck. Let's say their paycheck is $247. Well, they're going to tithe $24.70. They really are. I've seen this time after time after time. They won't tithe 25. They'll tithe $24.70, and they'll round up 25, but the 30 cents as an offering. This is one of the crazy things about the tithes and offerings in the modern vernacular, is because it creates a spirit of legalism in the church. So that 30 cents. So in this case, Malachi says, "You're robbing me in tithes and offerings." God speaking through Malachi. What are the offerings that he's talking about? Is it an offering of money? And if there are offerings in the Old Testament that Malachi can be talking about that were cash, silver, gold, whatever, they're rare. There was, like I said, there was the redemption of the firstborn. There was the census money. There was the temple tax. There were times people gave money, but offerings were much different. There are several kinds of offerings. And most of the offerings giving in the Old Testament, specifically written by Malachi, would be things that had to be done in order to atone for our sin. Now, we already have Jesus has already remitted sins, not covered it. He's obliterated it. But they had to give offerings every single day. They had to give offerings once a month during the new moon, and they had to give them every week for the Sabbath, and every year during the festivals. In my article, "What are the offerings in the Old Testament?" or in the book of Malachi. So here's some of the daily offerings. The daily offerings, Numbers 28, 4 and 5, offer one lamb in the morning and the other at twilight. So this is constantly covering by blood, because without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins, right? Together with a grain offering of a tenth of an ephah of finest flour mixed with a quarter of a hin of oil from pressed olives. Offer the second at twilight, along with the same kind of grain offering and drink offering that you offer in the morning. That this is a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. So there, daily, so twice a day, blood was being shed as an offering. Weekly offerings on the Sabbath, Numbers 28. On the Sabbath day, make an offering of 2 lambs, a year old without defect, with its drink offering and a grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil. This is the burnt offering for every Sabbath, in addition to the regular burnt offering and its drink offering. So Sabbath offerings were in addition to the daily offerings. And then they had monthly offerings that were given at the new moon. Numbers 28:11. On the first of every month, present to the Lord a burnt offering of 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs, a year old, all without defect. And verse 15, besides the regular burnt offering with its drink offering, 1 male goat is to be presented to the Lord as a sin offering. So each new moon demanded offerings. Then they had annual offerings. So can you imagine the offerings that were brought to the temple for this, and how it was just a slaughterhouse of sacrifice that was necessary under the old covenant, because there was no eternal sacrifice by Jesus yet. And this is typology, and this is kind of getting our minds saying we need something better. They were offering twice a day. And so the Passover offering, they had the offering for the Passover. And the same thing, it was 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, and a goat and a male goat as a sin offering. And then they had the Festival of Weeks, the same thing. And then they had a male goat. The Festival of Trumpets offering, the same thing. More of these offerings that were given that were not money. The Atonement offering, the Day of Atonement offering, the same thing.
Yom Kippur, atone for your sins.
Include 1 male goat as a sin offering, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, all without defect. The Festival of Tabernacles. So all these offerings were, in a way, for what had not happened yet, because Jesus had not been born, did not live and fulfill the law, die, be resurrected, and ascended. These are offerings that had to be done for sin nature. And when we have Jesus now, thank you very much. But see, these offerings were not financial, and they were not financial in capacity. And so I suggest that the offerings given in Malachi and the tithes are impossible for the Christian to give. A lot of people automatically assume I'm against giving money, and that could not be further from the truth. I believe that Christians should practice and promote radical, revolutionary, fearless generosity. But I also believe that we don't need to take scriptures out of context to support that belief. Paul told Timothy that the laborer was worthy of his wage, right? And that the elders deserve double honor. Those are contextually, those are financial scriptures. I believe, I'm a local church guy, submitted and committed to a local church, and the majority of what my wife and I give goes to our local church. And we give, I believe we give in a way that's honorable to Christ and to his word. We don't need to make things up or twisted. We don't need twisted scriptures to coerce, manipulate people to give. Yes, we are human and we are filled with a sin nature, and greed is legitimate, but that does not make the ends justifying the means. We don't get to all of a sudden twist things. And a bad reason to tithe is, well, if we didn't tithe, how would the church function? Well, the church didn't function on a tithe for several hundred years after the ascension of Christ. Tithing was argued and fought about a lot, right? So even in Acts 15, when there was a lot of Gentiles that became Christian, and they didn't have the background of the Old Testament and understand the concept of tithing food or animals. They had zero idea what was going on. And then so the Jewish Christians began to say, well, these Gentiles need to actually keep the law of Moses. And there was the very first church council, the Council of Jerusalem, and it's found in Acts 15. And the apostles, did in huddle. They talked about this. What do we need? Do they need to be circumcised? They need to do this. And there were only a couple things that they said they needed to do from the Old Testament. They needed to abstain from sexual immorality, and they need to not eat food sacrificed to idols. Tithing was actually not even mentioned. That would have been a perfect time for the apostles to say, yes, they need to give 10% of whatever. But see, they would know how the tithing system worked because they lived it. So I'm going to go as bold to say Peter, a fisherman, John, James, Andrew, fishermen, did not tithe because there's no biblical evidence in the law saying fishermen bring your tithe to the Levites. There's a lot of logistical problems with that, right? To think about bringing a bunch of fish to a temple. Carpenters, Jesus, tent makers, Paul, tax collectors, Matthew, Zacchaeus would not have tithed. That didn't stop Zacchaeus from giving half of all his money to the poor, though. So there is no scriptural evidence or reference for this. So I contend that Christians cannot rob God with tithes and offering. Should they give? They should. How should they give? Well, we'll stick with 2 Corinthians 9:7 that says that we give according to what we've decided in our heart, cheerfully, not under compulsion or coercion. And Paul also talked about in 1 Corinthians 16:2 that we give as God has blessed us. Right? So we can't superimpose some arbitrary 10% number because even that number is not really legitimate. And people might say, well, Abraham, 10%. Well, Abraham was a very specific situation. It was prescriptive, not descriptive, and that was not normative going forward. Abraham gave 10% of war spoils to Melchizedek, and then 90%, roughly 90% everything else to the king of Sodom. So Abraham kept nothing. And we don't build doctrines around that either. Now, some people try to, I think Augustine believed that, and there was some arguments about that. Truthful, everything we have belongs to God, but how we divide it up and how we give to him and the gospel causes is between the person and God. And I believe when Christians are properly positioned financially, they will give radically, generously, revolutionarily, and fearlessly. And we can do all the great things. But I think telling people they have to give and forcing them into some law thing is problematic. And people aren't even doing it anyways. People aren't doing it. And then they live with guilt, shame, and probably a little bit of fear of sin. The whole thing needs a revolution or reformation, right? So there you go. Tithes and offering, what are they? In the book of Malachi, they are food items, and the offerings, for the most part, were things for burnt, sin, trespass, peace, fellowship offerings, and they were given daily, monthly, annually, weekly, daily, weekly, monthly, annually, and they were for the festivals, which we just don't celebrate anymore. I hope this has been helpful. If so, please like, subscribe, share, comment. And until then, I dare you to profit so you can practice, promote radical, revolutionary, fearless generosity. And I will see you soon with a new video. Until then, blessings to you and your family.